Okay, in this video we are going to pick up right where we left off in class in our discussion of Airbus and Boeing and estimate, to the extent possible, our value of the VLCT program. So for this video you should have the handout that I gave to you in class sitting in front of you, where you should be on page 0 with roadmap, and you should have that in front of you as well as the screen which shows the model, the Excel spreadsheet that we'll be using for this discussion. Okay, so before we jump into the spreadsheet, let's quickly review the roadmap of what we're planning on doing in this next 15 or 20 minutes or so. So we have 2 questions to answer, and under the roadmap these questions are listed under part 1 and part 2. So under part 1, the first question we need to answer is, what is the value of the VLCT program on its own, absent any competitive effects? So before we can overlay competition and what we think Airbus and Boeing are going to do, we have to first establish a baseline of how valuable is this program in general. So we're going to do this in part 1 under various assumptions, and those, by varying our assumptions, it's going to allow us to determine how much uncertainty there is associated with that value. So those are the questions of part 1. What is the value of the VLCT program under varying assumptions, and what is the value under our baseline assumptions, and how much uncertainty is associated with that value? So the way we're going to do this is by following the 2 bullet points under part 1. So we're first going to develop a baseline estimate of the VLCT program using Airbus's assumptions, and those assumptions are going to cover demand for airplanes, so how many airplanes they think they can sell over a 20-year period, at what price and margin, and costs, and these are development costs, what it's going to take to bring a VLCT or a super jumbo to market. I'm going to use those terms interchangeably, super jumbo and VLCT. Okay, so that's the first bullet point. The second bullet point is, once we establish a baseline, then we're going to start playing around with some of our assumptions and relaxing some of these inputs in order to get a general sense of how much uncertainty is associated with our baseline. So this bullet reads, we're going to relax several inputs. What does it do to the value? And given what it does to the value, how much uncertainty is there? So what inputs are we going to relax? There's generally 4 categories of those. So first we're going to relax our pricing and our margin assumptions. So what price they think they can sell the plane at. Maybe they've underestimated that price, maybe they've overestimated the price. Same with margins. Maybe they've underestimated margins. What is that going to do to the value of the program? Same with development costs. They estimate development costs over a huge range. So for our baseline, we'll take the midpoint. But what if they come at the low end of that range? What if they come in at the high end of that range? What is that going to do to the value? The third piece that we're going to play around with is this so-called terminal growth rate. So what's a terminal growth rate? This program is, we are going to estimate it as if it's infinitely lived, meaning that it's going to go on forever. We're only going to estimate in our model 25 years of either cash consumed or cash generated. So after 25 years, we're going to estimate the rest using an assumption about how fast we think the program is going to grow at year 26 and beyond, and that's called a terminal growth rate. And so we're going to see how sensitive our value is to that assumption. And then the last big category we're going to consider is demand. So Airbus assumes that there's a demand for 1,000 planes over a 20-year period. Boeing and outside analysts are not as optimistic as Airbus is. So what happens when you use their estimates of demand? So that's going to give us some ranges of value of the program, and altogether those sets of estimates we're going to create will give us a value of the VLCT program and its associated uncertainty, independent of competitive effects, and we'll call this sort of the one firm enter scenario. So that's part 1. Part 2 is, now we're going to overlay competition. So how might competition affect this estimate? And we're going to consider competition from 2 angles. So the first is, how might competition affect our estimates of the value of the super jumbo program? And the second part is, how might competition in the super jumbo segment affect Boeing's 747 program? Because they're not independent. If you enter the super jumbo program, you are going to have spillover effects on selling and the market for the 7.4 program. And how do we estimate the size of those effects? So those are the 2 bullet points under under part 2. So the first bullet point, we're going to consider how competition might impact pricing, margins, and the total value of the VLCT program in terms of 2 scenarios. The first scenario is what we'll call the cooperate scenario. This is where Airbus and Boeing jointly enter and co-create a VLCT, and they split the profits between themselves. And a compete scenario. This is where Airbus and Boeing both enter the super jumbo segment independently and compete against each other. And what might that do to the value of the super jumbo program for each of the competitors, respectively? And then part 2 is we consider what happens to the 7.4 program under 2 entry scenarios. The first entry scenario is what happens if only one firm enters super jumbo. And this would likely be either Airbus enters alone, or, for instance, Airbus and Boeing cooperate and enter. And what happens to the super jumbo program? What happens to the 7.4 program if both Airbus and Boeing enter and compete in the super jumbo space? Okay, so if one firm enters the super jumbo, or if 2 firms enter and compete. So that is going to be part 2, and by the end of part 2, we should have some estimates of the payoffs to both Airbus and Boeing under various competitive scenarios where they cooperate or they both enter and compete. Okay, so that is the roadmap of where we're going with this. So now turn to page 1 and let's get started. Okay, part 1. We are first going to establish a baseline scenario using the midpoint of Airbus's assumptions to get a sense of, on average, how, or in general, how profitable do they think a super jumbo program can be. To do this, now look at your screen. We are going to use this discounted cash flow model. For those of you that have taken corporate finance, this type of spreadsheet should be secondhand to you. For those of you that have never taken corporate finance before, fear not. It's not important that you understand the mechanics of what's going on. Let me just explain the high level of what you should know. So in these green boxes here, we're going to enter assumptions of what we think about demand, pricing, costs here in every green box. The model up here is going to do the work of taking these assumptions and then modeling for each year of 25 years. So this is year 1, year 2, year 3, all the way up to 25 years. You can see 25 up here. So for each year, the model is going to take our assumptions and estimate either the net cash consumed or the net cash generated by this project, by this program. And then for each year, you're going to get that net cash consumed or generated. The model is going to add all of those up over time, discounted for future risk of cash, of money. So that's the D in DCF, or the discounting in discounted cash flow. It's going to add them all up, and in this box here is going to create what's called a net present value. So over the sum of all the cash created over 25 years added up will be your NPV. And it's actually not just over 25 years, but as I talked about earlier, at the end of 25 years, the model just says, okay, year 26 through infinity, let's estimate how much cash this program is generating and about how fast we think it's going to grow through eternity, and that is going to be captured in this so-called terminal growth rate. So it adds up years 1 through, or years 0 through 25, and then the lump sum of our estimated terminal growth value, and plops it all here under net present value, and that is going to be our estimated value of the program. Okay. All right, so that is how we're going to use the model. And just briefly, why are we using this model here as opposed to doing a simpler back-of-the-envelope calculation? The general idea behind discounted cash flow models is when you have a long-lived project or company, and you have a mismatch between the timing of the costs and the benefits, then you want to model those over time so that you can account for the time value of money. So in this case, we have an aircraft manufacturing program where all the costs need to be borne up front, and then most of the benefits are going to be in the future, and so using a DCF allows us to account for that mismatch of timing. Okay, so now let's jump into our base case. Page 1, top of the page. One firm enters. Let's enter in Airbus's baseline assumptions. So they assume 1,000 planes over a 20-year period, or 50 planes per year. This second assumption here asks, how many years do we think it's going to take to ramp up to a steady state? This is more of an advanced option. We're not going to use this throughout this video, so I'm going to put 0 here. This would be, for instance, if we wanted to model that it's not, we won't be able to sell 50 planes immediately. You know, it might take us, the first year we might sell 5 planes, then 10 planes, then 15 planes, and then ultimately build up to 50 planes. But we're going to be very optimistic here and say, starting from year 0, we're going to be up and running and selling 50 planes per year. Okay, selling price per plane. So the case gives us this range. It's $150 to $250 million. We're going to take the midpoint and assume that they can sell the planes right in the middle of that at $200 million a year. And in terms of operating margin, the case gives us a reasonable range for margins where, you know, planes in a competitive bidding scenario tend to make about 15% margin, and then the 7-4 program in its monopoly type of position makes 27% margin. So let's just take the midpoint of that range for now and assume we get a 20% margin just to get started. Okay, and we'll play around with that number. In terms of development costs, the case gives us a huge range that Airbus is estimating, anywhere from $5 billion to $20 billion. So let's take the midpoint of that and assume, at least on the onset, that it's going to take us $12.5 billion to develop the plane. They also estimate it's going to be between 4 and 10 years. So let's take the midpoint and assume it's going to take us 7 years. Working capital, the case gives us this information. Airbus estimates it's going to take about $1 billion in working capital over 5 years and $1 billion in CapEx over 5 years. And then after that initial working capital is sunk over 5 years, they assume it's going to be about $20 million of annual run rate of ongoing costs. So those are all of our costs. We're nearly done with our baseline scenario. All we have to do is input this terminal growth rate. So this is, again, the ongoing growth of this program, the growth in demand for planes after our estimates are over, so from year 26 through infinity. The case gives us this again, so Airbus assumes that there's going to be a 6% annual growth in demand for super jumbos, so let's just put in 6% here. Okay, great. So now we have our base case. You should have this on the top of your handout too. And this tells us that using Airbus's assumptions, we obtain a profitable estimate for the VLC program at about $900 million. And so, you know, I put barely profitable in the handout. It's not a great return, but at least it's not negative. Okay, so now we're going to move on to our sensitivities, part of our roadmap where we start relaxing these assumptions and see what happens. So let's go through these fairly quickly, but let's start with part 2, which is, okay, well, how sensitive do we think this value here, this $900 million value, is to our margin assumptions? So we mentioned before, we have a range of between 15 and 27%. Let's see what happens. So at the low end of our range, let's assume we only can sell the plane competitively at 15% margin. That's enough to swing the NPV of this project down to minus $2 billion. And if we're able to command monopoly-like margins at 27% margins, then that's enough to swing the program in the opposite direction to positive $5 billion. So margins make a huge difference in this scenario. And by the way, they probably wouldn't even vary independently, but they would also vary with selling price. So if you imagine, for instance, that you could sell the plane at $250 million at the top end of the margin, sorry, the top end of the pricing range and at the top end of the operating margin range, then you get even a heftier gain here, where the program is almost worth $9 billion, which is even better. Okay, so that's the first sensitivity that we run. Now let's go back to our base case here and look at how sensitive the project is to development costs. So again, we have a huge range of development costs. Let's first take the pessimistic scenario. So now we're at the top of page 2 of your handout. And imagine that this this program takes a lot more, it comes in at the high end of how expensive it's going to be to develop. So let's plug in $20 billion here. We can see that that immediately swings the project to negative territory at minus $4.5 billion or so. But if they're able to come in at the low end of development costs, sorry, that's the wrong box. Here we go. Then again, that's enough to swing the value by $10 million from minus $4 billion up to positive $6 billion. So conclusion on this piece is this project is heavily, heavily sensitive to whether they can meet their development estimates. Okay, they can either, if they come in under, it'll be fairly profitable. If they go over, it's enough to swing this project into negative territory. Okay, part 4 of our sensitivity analysis, let's go back to our baseline here, looks at sensitivity to development time. It's less sensitive, but you can see here if we're able to, if this project takes us 10 years to develop instead of 7, then it's enough to cut some of the value off the project, and if we're able to do it quickly, then it adds more value to the project. Not as much as development cost, price, or margin. Okay, second to last piece of part 1 is terminal growth rate. So here we sort of blithely put in 6% as our terminal growth rate assumption here, which is the which would be how fast the market would grow after 25 years through infinity. So for those of you that have taken corporate finance, you might look at this number and shudder a little bit. And let me explain why for the rest of you. The general idea behind choosing a reasonable terminal growth rate is that if you generally choose one that's faster than global demand, global aggregate demand, then the implication of that assumption is that your industry is going to keep on growing and growing and growing faster than the market. And so here, the terminal growth rate we've chosen, 6%, is about twice what global aggregate demand is. So you would imagine if global GDP is growing at about 2 to 4% a year, or say 3% a year, and we assume that aircraft demand is growing at 6% a year, eventually all demand in the world is going to be aircraft demand, because you can't have something growing at twice what global demand is without taking over. So this is an extraordinarily high terminal growth rate, and probably one that's not quite reasonable when you think about the fact that demand for aircraft pretty much maps to global growth. So let's put one more in line with global growth, which is 3%, and see what that does to our estimates. So you can see here, as soon as we put a more reasonable terminal growth rate assumption, it's enough to wipe out that $900 million of surplus in the program and bring it to minus $600 million. Okay, so let's bring that back to our optimistic 6%, just so we get back to our base case and do our last part of part 1, which is looking at demand assumptions. So as I noted earlier, Airbus has the most optimistic demand assumptions at $1 billion a year. $1 billion, 1,000 planes over 20 years. Let's use the analyst assumptions of only 25 planes. So if we use the analyst assumptions of 25 planes a year or 500 planes total, then this project is wildly unsuccessful. And if we use that in conjunction with a more reasonable terminal growth rate, which those two assumptions probably go together, then this project loses $5.5 billion. Now, Boeing's assumptions are even less optimistic, so let's zoom over to Boeing. We'll go back to our 6% terminal growth rate, but Boeing itself only assumes half of the analyst demand, which itself is half of Airbus's demand. So Boeing is assuming there's an aggregate total demand over a 20-year period of about 250 planes. So let's round up and say 13 planes a year, which would roughly map to Boeing's estimated demand. So once you assume that you only are going to sell 500 aircraft instead of 250 aircraft instead of 1,000 aircraft, then this project is a huge loss maker. And once you put in a more reasonable terminal growth rate, then that brings you in the hole by $8 billion. So Boeing's internal estimates, if they are close to this, would say that the super jumbo is a big loss-making enterprise. Okay, so that brings us to the end of part one. Let's just go put our baseline back here. So we get to where we started. And we have three conclusions so far. You should be in the middle of page 4 at this point. Conclusion 1. Using Airbus's optimistic base case, the VLCT program can make money, but barely. Okay. Conclusion 2. However, this baseline assumption is actually fairly fragile, and it's very sensitive to assumptions about operating margins. So if we assume, say, 25 or 27% margin, it's a huge success. If it's more closer to the competitive margin of 15%, it's a huge failure. It's likewise sensitive to development costs and to terminal growth rate assumptions. So there's a huge uncertainty around this 900 million number here. Okay, and lastly, conclusion 3 is once you move away from Airbus's projections of demand to less optimistic assumptions about demand, sorry, this should read in the handout 500 or 250 planes, then the program is a huge money loser. So ultimately, whether you think the super jumbo is viable or not viable, independent of competitive effects, so just on its own, is going to be highly sensitive to what you think, where you think the industry is going. If you think it's going hub and spoke globally and there's going to be large demand for super jumbos, then you are optimistic about this program. If you think that the demand is going to be much less and there's only going to be, it's going to go more point to point, and there's going to be less demand for super jumbos, then this program has a potential to be a huge loss maker. Okay, so it really reflects two very divergent views of where you think the industry is going. Okay, let's move on to page 5 now and think about competitive effects. So, so we're back to our base case here. Let's think about case 1, which is the cooperation case. So let's imagine that Boeing and Airbus decide to jointly cooperate and launch the super jumbo together, and let's take Airbus's assumptions as given. Then it's kind of a trivial outcome. You have a value of this program of $900 million that they split 50-50. You can get more complicated than this, but let's just keep it simple for today and say they take that surplus and divide it down the middle. Okay, so that's the cooperate case. Now let's move on to the more interesting cases, the compete cases. So let's imagine that Airbus and Boeing both enter the super jumbo space, the VLCT, and they compete against each other. So what happens with competition? Competition should drive both prices and margins down. Okay, so now let's see what that does. Let's imagine it drives prices all the way down to the low end of the range, and same with margins all the way down to the low end of the range. Okay, so what we can see is competition in this segment takes what was a marginally productive profitable program and makes it wildly unprofitable. Okay, and you could imagine, well, maybe if they're competing, they're selling more planes, something of that nature. So how many planes would they have to sell for this to even remotely break even? So it's not 70 planes per year, it's not 80 planes per year. You can kind of inch your way up until you figure out that they would have to sell 82 planes in steady state for them to even break even on this program. And I think even Airbus at that point would say that that's just not even realistic. So conclusion 1 from this compete case, this is on the interim conclusion on the bottom of page 5, is that this market, even if you believe it's profitable and a good market to be in, there's only room for one firm. As soon as you have two firms entering and they compete against each other, the profits get wiped out. So there's room for either 0 or at most one firm. Okay, let's go back to our base case here. Moving along. Now we're going to look at what we think is going to happen to the 7-4 program. Okay, so we've thought about the super jumbo program, the compete and cooperate case. What do we think the entry of 1 or 2 firms in the super jumbo segment is going to do to the 7-4 segment? Okay, so let's take this model here and adapt it to the 7.4. Okay, we're just going to kind of, twist it a little bit beyond what it's supposed to be used for, just to help us understand from Boeing's perspective what we think competition might do to our 7.4. So they sell 35 planes a year. They generally sell their 747s at $150 million, and they get 27% margin. All of these development costs have long been recognized, so they have no more expenses in this area. We're going to zero all of these out. And let's set the terminal growth rate at a more reasonable, from Boeing's perspective, 3%. Okay. All right. So this, you putting these sets of numbers gives us a back of the envelope estimate of the value of the 7.4 program for Boeing. And here we're going to move away from this red number here down to row 53, where all it does here is look at the annual cash contribution of the 7.4 program to Boeing. So this number here comes from row 18 of the model. And row 18 of the model estimates this is the total cash flow generated by the 7.4 program in any given year. So what we can see here is this is actually very close to what Boeing tells us, because this is estimating that the 747 program produces for Boeing about $1.4 billion a year, and that is very close to what the case said, where they said of the $1.9 billion in total profits to Boeing, 70 cents of every dollar comes from the 7.4 program. And this is, in fact, 70% of $1.9 billion, or $1.95 billion. So this is actually very close to Boeing's actual numbers. Okay, so in this base case, the 7.4 program, with no super jumbo competition whatsoever, hands Boeing a check for $1.4 billion every year. Now let's imagine, and where are we? So now we are on page 6, the middle of the page. Okay, so we just read the interim conclusion that the 7.4 program contributes $1.4 billion to Boeing each year. And so the bottom line there for you to recognize is this is a hugely, hugely, hugely important program to Boeing. Okay, this aircraft is essentially their profits. Okay, with a couple other programs on the edges, but this is the core of Boeing's profits. Okay, so that is the key takeaway from scenario 3 on the top of page 6. Now we're going to ask, what does entry in the Super Jumbo program do to this hugely, hugely, hugely important 7.4 program? So let's imagine that we only have one firm, let's say Airbus, entering at the Super Jumbo level, but doing so affects demand for the 7.4. Not by a ton, but by enough to lower the number of planes that they can sell by year, let's say by 30%. So instead of selling 35 planes per year, now they sell 25. And the other 10 planes that they would have sold are now being bought, let's say, by Emirates Airline as super jumbos as opposed to jumbo jets. Okay, so instead of selling 35 planes, they now only sell 25 planes. And let's imagine that they sell those with some moderate price competition. So instead of being $150 million with some competition from the super jumbo, now they're selling it for $120 million and 20% profits. Okay, what do we notice happens to the value of their program with just these very simple assumptions here? So going from 35 planes to 25 planes, with a moderate price discount and a moderate hit to their operating margin, look at what happens. Instead of the 7.4 contributing $1.4 billion to Boeing's profits, now it's slashed by 2/3, and they're only contributing $600 million. Remember, this is the core of Boeing's profits, and it just got hammered by moderate competition in the super jumbo segment. Now let's imagine there's even more competition in the super jumbo segment. Let's imagine that both Boeing and Airbus enter. Now remember, this is hugely unprofitable for both of them, but they're not cooperating, and let's just imagine that they're hemorrhaging money on the super jumbo program and competing. So with that heavy competition, now we are on page 6 on the right-hand side. Let's imagine that it slashes demand for the 747 in half. Okay, so instead of selling 35 planes a year, now I'm only selling 18 planes a year. Why? Because both Airbus and Boeing are selling super jumbos and they're massively competing, and so they're practically giving those planes away for free. Okay, so it's hard for me to compete in the 747 against them, so I'm only selling 18 planes a year, and I have to give even more price discounts. Let's say I go down to 110 million and 15% margin. Okay, wow. Now look what happens. Now instead of writing a check for $1.4 billion like I used to, my profits have been hammered. And the 747 program now only contributes less than $300 million a year to me. Okay, so interim conclusion at the bottom of page 6. Entry in the VLCT segment, which I've been calling the super jumbo segment interchangeably, decimates the annual contribution of the 747 program by Boeing to close to $1 billion. Okay, and that is the core of the company. That is the guts of how Boeing makes money. So, top of page 7, conclusions from this analysis. There is room only for one player, or maybe for cooperation, if you want to make money in VLCT. So who will it be? Would it be Airbus? Would it be Boeing? Would it be the cooperation? Can they cooperate in this segment? And if they do, and they enter, the VLCT entry has the potential to decimate the 747 program, and hence Boeing's profits. So 1 or 2 entrants in VLCT can cost the 747 program around $1 billion a year, or half of Boeing's total profits. So that is what we get out of these 2 analyses using this model. And where we're going to pick up when we meet again on Thursday is, what does this mean for how both of these companies compete?